I wasn't supposed to see Nelson like that. If I had come home 5 minutes later, if I hadn't forgotten my headphones, if the hallway light hadn't flickered exactly when it did, none of this would have happened. But life doesn't work on ifs. It works on timing. And that night, my timing was terrible. Or perfect, depending on how you look at it. I'm Omar, 24, working a remote customer support job that mostly involves pretending I understand people's Wi-Fi problems while drinking way too much coffee. I live in a small apartment complex that sits somewhere between cozy and questionable. The walls are thin, the elevator groans like it's fighting for its life, and the hallway carpet has probably seen things no carpet should ever see. But rent was cheap, the internet was decent, and most importantly, my neighbor Nelson lived across the hall. I noticed Nelson the day he moved in. You know how some people just carry this quiet gravity around them? Like the room adjusts when they enter, even if they're not trying to be noticed? That was Nelson. Tall, dark hair always slightly messy, tattoos that peeked out from under his sleeves like unfinished sentences, and this calm expression that made him seem older than he probably was. He didn't talk much, didn't blast music, didn't have friends over constantly like half the people in the building. Mostly, he kept to himself, which somehow made me notice him even more. Our first interaction was painfully normal. I was struggling with grocery bags, one of them ripping dramatically like something out of a sitcom, when Nelson opened his door at the exact wrong moment and watched an apple roll past his feet. He picked it up, held it out, and gave me a small smile. "You dropped this." That was it. 2 words. But his voice was low and warm in a way that lingered longer than it should have. After that, we settled into neighbor familiarity. The nod in the hallway, the occasional hey. Once, he helped me jumpstart my car in the parking lot without making it a big deal. Another time, I held a package for him when he was at work. We existed in each other's orbit without fully crossing into friendship. Still, I thought about him more than I should. Not in some dramatic rom-com way, just quiet curiosity, like wondering what music he listened to when no one was around, or what his life looked like outside the fragments I saw. And then there was the night everything shifted. It was a Thursday. I remember because Thursdays were my late gaming nights with friends, which meant energy drinks, yelling at strangers online, and absolutely wrecking my sleep schedule. Around 11:30 p.m., I realized I'd left my noise-canceling headphones in my car. Normally, I would have ignored it, but my teammates were already roasting me in voice chat. So I sighed, grabbed my keys, and stepped into the hallway. The building was quiet, that specific kind of late-night quiet where every sound feels louder than it should. My footsteps muffled into the carpet, the distant hum of someone's TV behind closed doors, the elevator rattling somewhere far above. I locked my door, turned, and froze. Nelson's apartment door was slightly open, not wide, just enough to spill a thin strip of light into the hallway. I probably wouldn't have thought anything of it, except Nelson was standing outside it, back turned to me, shoulders tense like he was bracing for something. And he wasn't alone. Mrs. Klein's door, the elderly woman 2 units down, was open too. My brain tried to make sense of the scene. Nelson stood halfway between the 2 apartments, holding something in his hands. Small, rectangular, package. Mrs. Klein wasn't there. The hallway light above flickered once, buzzing softly, and Nelson shifted like the sound startled him. That's when he turned. Our eyes met instantly, and whatever expression had been on his face disappeared so fast I almost thought I imagined it. "Omar," he said, voice quiet but sharp with surprise. I looked between him, the package, Mrs. Klein's open door, then back at him. "What are you doing?" The question hung there, heavier than I intended. Nelson didn't answer right away. He just stared at me, chest rising slowly, like he was deciding which version of the truth to offer. "I can explain," he finally said, which, in my experience, is never a reassuring sentence. I crossed my arms, leaning against my door. "Then explain." For a second, I thought he might brush it off, laugh, say something casual. But instead, Nelson glanced down at the package in his hands like it weighed far more than cardboard should. "She asked me to grab it earlier," he said. "Delivery guy left it outside. I was bringing it in." It sounded reasonable, completely normal. Except, then why does it look like you got caught doing something illegal? The corner of his mouth twitched despite himself. But the tension didn't leave his shoulders. You're very observant, Omar. That's one way to put it. Silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable exactly, but charged. Like there was a second conversation happening underneath the words. Nelson stepped closer, lowering his voice. I wasn't stealing it. I didn't say you were. But you thought it. I didn't answer, because he wasn't wrong. He exhaled softly, running a hand through his hair. She's in the hospital, he said. Mrs. Klein fell this morning. Her daughter called me. That knocked the suspicion right out of me. Oh, yeah. He looked almost embarrassed, like being misunderstood bothered him less than needing to explain himself at all. The hallway suddenly felt smaller. So you're just taking care of her place? I asked. Trying to. Something about that answer, simple, understated, settled warmly in my chest. I pushed off the door. Well, I said, now I feel like a jerk. Nelson smiled then. Not the polite neighbor smile. A real one. Soft, slightly crooked, disarming in a way that made my stomach do something deeply inconvenient. You're allowed, he said. From your perspective, I did look suspicious. I laughed quietly. The tension dissolved, replaced by something lighter, more familiar, and yet different. Because now we were standing in a quiet hallway at nearly midnight, and I was suddenly very aware of the way Nelson looked at me. Not casually, not neighbor-like, just aware. Well, I said, holding up my keys. I was actually heading to my car. Nelson nodded, but neither of us moved. It was one of those strange pauses where leaving feels like the wrong choice, even if there's no logical reason to stay. Omar, he said after a moment. Yeah. Thanks for asking instead of assuming. I shrugged, trying to ignore the warmth creeping up my neck. Don't make me regret that. His eyes held mine a second longer than necessary. I won't. At the time, I believed him. I had no idea that catching Nelson in that hallway was only the beginning. I should have just gone to my car, grabbed my headphones, returned to my apartment, pretended nothing had shifted. But instead, I stood there like an idiot while Nelson adjusted the package in his hands and glanced back toward Mrs. Klein's apartment. I was about to lock up, he said. You mind? Yeah, of course. I stepped aside, watching as he moved with easy familiarity inside her place. He didn't hesitate like someone snooping. He walked straight to the small entry table, set the package down, turned off a lamp, and came back out, locking the door carefully. He handed me a spare key. Her daughter left this with me. That small detail hit harder than it should have. Trust. Mrs. Klein trusted him enough to hand over access to her home, and I had assumed the worst in 2 seconds flat. When he finished locking up, he lingered close, closer than usual. You heading out now? He asked. Yeah. Headphones. Emergency. He huffed softly. Serious gamer problems. You have no idea. We started walking toward the elevator together. Felt strange. We'd lived across from each other for almost 8 months. But this was the first time we'd walked somewhere side by side like this. Usually it was passing moments, brief exchanges. Now the quiet didn't feel awkward. It felt intentional. The elevator arrived with its usual dramatic groan. We stepped in and the doors slid shut behind us. What were you really thinking back there? I glanced at him. About what? When you saw me. He wasn't defensive, just curious. I hesitated, then sighed. I thought you were stealing from a 78-year-old woman. He barked out a quiet laugh. Brutal. You looked guilty. I looked startled. Same thing. The elevator dinged at the lobby level, but neither of us stepped out immediately. You always assume the worst? He asked, softer now. I met his eyes. No, I admitted. Just sometimes. His gaze held mine for a second longer than it should have. Good to know, he murmured. We stepped out together into the empty lobby. The glass doors reflected us side by side, and for a weird second, I noticed how natural we looked standing there. like we'd been doing this for years. Outside, the night air was cool and quiet. The parking lot lights cast long shadows across the pavement. My car was near the far end. Nelson's truck was parked 2 spots away. He stopped when we reached the vehicles. "I'll let you get back to saving your virtual world," he said. I unlocked my car but didn't open the door yet. "Hey, Nelson." "Yeah." I don't know what possessed me. Maybe it was the late hour. Maybe it was the way he'd looked at me in the elevator. Maybe it was the fact that this was the longest real conversation we'd ever had. "You want to come up after?" I asked casually. "I've got beer." There was a pause. A small one, but noticeable. "You inviting me out of guilt?" he asked. "Maybe a little." He studied my face, like he was searching for something underneath my words. "And the other part?" I swallowed. Maybe I just realized I don't actually know my neighbor. Something changed in his expression then. Not dramatic, just softer. "I'll take the beer," he said. My stomach did that inconvenient flip again. "Cool." We grabbed our things and headed back inside together. This time, the elevator ride felt different. Quieter. Charged. When we stepped onto our floor, the hallway lights flickered again. That same faint buzz overhead. I unlocked my apartment and stepped inside. Nelson followed. And suddenly, having him in my space felt surreal. My apartment wasn't messy, but it wasn't exactly guest-ready either. A hoodie tossed over the couch. Controller on the coffee table. Empty energy drink can near my desk. "Nice setup," he said, glancing around. "You're legally not allowed to judge." I wouldn't dare. I grabbed 2 beers from the fridge and handed him one. We sat on opposite ends of the couch at first. Safe distance. Neutral territory. The TV cast soft light across the room, but neither of us turned it on. "So," he said after a sip, "how long have you lived here?" "Almost a year. And you've barely talked to me." I shrugged. "You don't exactly look approachable." His eyebrows lifted. "Excuse me? You have this intense thing going on." He leaned back, amused. "Intense. In a good way," I added quickly. He watched me over the rim of his bottle. "You were easier to read tonight," he said. "How?" "You looked worried." "That's because I thought you were committing a crime." Still, there it was again. That subtle undercurrent. Like we weren't just talking about the hallway anymore. The silence stretched, but not empty. Heavy. Intentional. "So why do you help her?" I asked quietly. "Mrs. Klein." "Yeah." He took a slow breath. "She reminds me of my grandma." The answer surprised me. "She raised me," he added, almost as an afterthought. "Oh." He nodded once, gaze drifting toward the window. "She passed a couple years ago. Mrs. Klein needed help with groceries one day. Just kind of stuck." Something in his voice tightened slightly. I felt a shift inside my chest. The image I had of him, quiet, intimidating, distant, cracked a little. "You don't talk about yourself much," I said. "You don't ask much." "Fair." He looked back at me. "You always this curious?" "Only when something doesn't add up." "And I don't add up?" I held his gaze. "Not yet." That earned a real smile. "Depends how you look at it." My pulse stumbled. The air changed. Subtle but undeniable. "What does that mean?" I asked. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, bottle dangling loosely from his hand. "It means," he said carefully, "sometimes what looks wrong isn't." "It means," he repeated quietly, "context matters." I swallowed. "Context for what?" His jaw tightened slightly, like he was choosing his words carefully. "For assumptions," he said. "For intentions." There was something layered underneath that. Something unsaid. I took another sip of beer just to have something to do with my hands. "You think I misjudged you," I said. "I think you saw something suspicious and reacted like anyone would." "That's not an answer." He looked at me then. Fully. No teasing edge. No soft humor. Just direct. "You don't just observe, Omar," he said. "You feel things out. You read people." My pulse ticked up. And I think you knew I wasn't stealing." I opened my mouth to argue, but he wasn't wrong. The second our eyes met in the hallway, something in me had shifted. The suspicion had been quick, but it hadn't felt solid. More like reflex than belief. You looked scared, I admitted. Of what? Of being misunderstood. The room went quiet. He exhaled slowly. Yeah, he said. That one word carried more weight than the whole conversation before it. I shifted on the couch, angling slightly toward him. You get misunderstood a lot? A faint smile touched his mouth. Not amused, not bitter, just honest. Enough. I wanted to ask more. About his grandma. About why he kept to himself. About what had shaped that guarded calm he wore like armor. Instead, I said, "You don't have to." He held my gaze. Have to what? Do everything alone. The words slipped out before I could second-guess them. His expression softened in a way that made my chest ache. You invited me up for beer, he said. Yeah. You sure that's all this is? My heart slammed once, hard. What are you asking? I countered. His eyes dropped again, brief, almost imperceptible, then back to mine. I'm asking, he said slowly, if you're still assuming the worst. The air thickened, because now I knew. He wasn't talking about Mrs. Klein. He wasn't talking about stealing. He was talking about this. About us. I set my beer down on the coffee table, fingers slightly unsteady. I don't think this is the worst, I said carefully. His breathing shifted. Barely. But I noticed. You think it's wrong? He asked. The word hung heavy. Wrong. Like a challenge. Like a confession. I searched his face. The tension in his jaw. The vulnerability hidden behind that steady composure. You think it is? I asked back. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly, just enough to look at me fully. Growing up, he said, voice lower now, steadier. I learned to be careful. Careful how? With what people see. That hit deeper than I expected. You're not exactly subtle, I said lightly, trying to ease the intensity. A corner of his mouth lifted. I'm trying. I huffed out a quiet laugh. Then the silence returned. But it wasn't awkward. It was charged. Alive. You caught me tonight, he said again. Yeah. Looking like I was doing something wrong. I nodded. And now? He asked. I held his eyes. Now I think you were doing something right. The reality of it all settled in. This wasn't some random moment with a stranger. This was Nelson, the guy whose footsteps I recognized through the wall. The guy who brought groceries to Mrs. Klein. The guy who had quietly existed in the periphery of my daily life for months. And now he was here. What changed tonight? I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at me with that steady, thoughtful expression I was starting to understand better. You saw me, he said simply. I've always seen you. Not like that. I frowned slightly. In the hallway, he continued. You didn't look at me like the quiet neighbor. You looked at me like a person you were trying to understand. The sincerity in his voice hit deeper than I expected. That's kind of how I look at most people, I said. Not everyone notices. I bumped his shoulder lightly. You're more noticeable than you think. That earned a soft huff of amusement. I spent a long time trying not to be. Something in my chest tightened at that. Well, I said gently, you're bad at it. He smiled at that, a real one, eyes crinkling slightly. Good, he said. The quiet stretched again, but this time it felt comfortable enough that I let my head tip back against the couch. So what now? I asked. That question lingered between us. Not heavy, just real. We don't have to decide everything tonight, he said. Relief flickered through me. Thank God. But, he added, I'd like to not pretend that didn't happen. Agreed. And I'd like to take you out. That caught me off guard. Out. Dinner. Coffee. Something that doesn't involve suspicious hallway encounters. I laughed. That sounds very normal. I'm capable of normal. Jury's still out. He nudged my leg with his. You in? I pretended to think about it for a second. Yeah, I said. I'm in. The smile he gave me then was small but unmistakably relieved, like he'd been holding that breath for a while. We sat there a bit longer, talking about nothing important, work complaints, terrible parking situations, Mrs. Klein's cat that apparently hated everyone except Nelson. Felt easy, natural, like the awkward barrier that had existed for months had quietly dissolved. Eventually, I glanced at the time. Wow, it's almost 2. Your gaming friends are going to abandon you, he said. They already have. He stood, stretching slightly, and the movement pulled my attention in ways I tried not to analyze too closely. Probably should let you sleep, he said. I stood too, walking him to the door. The hallway outside was silent again, the flickering light now steady. We lingered in my doorway, neither of us quite ready to end the night. This was unexpected, I said. Yeah, but I'm glad I caught you doing the wrong thing. His eyes softened. Me too. Quiet pause. Good night, Omar. Good night, Nelson. He stepped across the hall, unlocking his door, and before going inside, he looked back. That same small smile. Then he disappeared into his apartment. I closed my door slowly, leaning against it for a second as everything replayed in my head. The hallway, the conversation, the kiss, the invitation. I caught my neighbor doing something I thought was wrong. But standing there in the quiet of my apartment, heart still racing and smiling like an idiot, it felt like I'd stumbled into something very right. The next morning, I woke up convinced I'd imagined half of it. That's how my brain works. If something good happens unexpectedly, it immediately tries to downgrade it into a dream. But then I rolled over, grabbed my phone, and saw a text from Nelson. Nelson, coffee later? 6? No hallway crimes involved. I stared at the screen for a solid 10 seconds before smiling like an idiot. So it was real. I spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing what to wear for a coffee date that technically wasn't labeled as a date, even though we both knew it was. Around 5:30, there was a knock on my door. Not a text. Not a ready. Through the wall. A knock. When I opened it, Nelson was standing there in a black t-shirt and jeans, hair slightly damp like he'd just showered. He looked different. Not physically, but less guarded. You clean up well, he said, eyes scanning me briefly. Wow, I replied. Is that your version of flirting? I'm pacing myself. We walked out together, this time not as neighbors accidentally sharing space, but intentionally side by side. The coffee shop was 3 blocks away. Small, warm lighting. For a second, it felt almost surreal, like we were stepping into a version of ourselves we'd quietly avoided. So, I said, wrapping my hands around my cup, how long? How long what? How long have you been thinking about it? He didn't play dumb. Instead, he leaned back slightly, considering. A while, he admitted. Probably longer than I should have. Months? Yeah. That did something dangerous to my ego. You hide it well, I said. I had to be sure. Sure of what? That I wasn't reading into things. I raised an eyebrow. You thought you were? He met my eyes directly. You look at me like you're trying to solve something. I laughed under my breath. I do not. You do. Okay. Maybe a little. He smiled into his coffee. There were moments, he continued. Elevator rides. Late-night hallway runs. You'd hold eye contact just a second too long. Heat crept up my neck. I thought you were just intense, I admitted. Intense, he repeated, amused. In a good way. He shook his head slightly. I didn't want to be wrong about you. That sentence landed heavier than the rest. You weren't, I said quietly. Our eyes held. There was no rush, no awkwardness, just a steady unraveling of something that had been wound tight for months. Halfway through our drinks, he asked, You ever dated someone close by? Like, in the building? Yeah. I shook my head. That's a logistical nightmare. That's what I thought. And yet, I added. And yet, he echoed. There was something honest about the way we talked, like neither of us was trying to oversell it. No dramatic promises, no sweeping declarations, Just two guys acknowledging that something real had been building quietly between them. When we left the coffee shop, the sky was darker, city lights reflecting in puddles from earlier rain. We walked slower than necessary. When we reached the apartment building, Nelson didn't immediately go inside. Instead, he stopped just before the entrance. "You nervous?" he asked. "About what?" "People knowing." I considered that. "About us." He nodded. I shrugged lightly. "It's not illegal." A small smile tugged at his mouth. "That's reassuring." "You?" He hesitated just slightly. "I've spent a lot of time not advertising things," he said. "Because?" He looked down briefly, then back at me. "Because sometimes it's easier to let people assume." The vulnerability in that admission made me step closer without thinking. "You don't have to assume anything with me," I said quietly. His eyes softened. "You still think I was doing the wrong thing?" he asked softly. I smiled. "No." He squeezed my hand once before letting go as we stepped inside. The elevator ride up felt lighter this time. When we reached our floor, we didn't rush apart. We walked down the hallway together like we had every right to. At our doors, we paused. "Dinner tomorrow?" he asked. "Look at you planning ahead." "I'm trying to be normal." "You're doing okay. Good night, Nelson." As I stepped into my apartment, I realized something. I hadn't just caught my neighbor doing the wrong thing. I caught him in the middle of being careful. And for the first time, he wasn't anymore. Dating your neighbor sounds cute in theory. In reality, it means you can hear when he drops something in his kitchen at 7 a.m. It means you know exactly when he gets home because his truck engine has this distinct low rumble. And it definitely means that when things feel off even slightly, there's no real escaping it. The first week after coffee was easy. Too easy. Dinner turned into late-night talks. One night, about 10 days after the hallway incident, Nelson was at my place again. We'd ordered takeout and were halfway through a terrible action movie neither of us was paying attention to. "You're staring," he murmured without looking at me. "I'm not." "You are." I sighed dramatically. "Okay, maybe I am." He turned his head slightly, eyes meeting mine. "What?" I hesitated, then said the thing that had been sitting in the back of my mind. "You're different here." "Different how?" "Softer." "Bad thing?" "No," I said quickly. "Just unexpected." He studied me carefully. "You still waiting to catch me doing something wrong?" The question hit closer than he probably meant it to, because if I was honest, a small part of me had been bracing. For distance, for cold feet, for that guarded wall to snap back into place. "I think I'm just not used to things being steady." "I'm not playing a game, Omar," he said quietly. "I know. Do you?" I met his eyes. "I'm trying to." Silence fell, but it wasn't tense. It was thoughtful. Then his phone buzzed on the coffee table. He glanced at it, and something changed. Subtle, but there. His jaw tightened. His shoulders stiffened slightly. The softness I just commented on retreated. "Everything okay?" I asked. He picked up the phone, screen angled away from me. "Yeah, just work." But his voice had shifted. Shorter, more closed. I lowered my legs from his lap. "Nelson." He looked at me, too quickly. "It's nothing. You just went from relaxed to ready to fight in 3 seconds. A faint flicker of irritation crossed his face. Not at me, at himself. I said it's nothing. And there it was. That wall. Not slammed up. Just raised a few inches. I felt something twist in my chest. "I'm not accusing you," I said evenly. "I'm asking." He stood up abruptly, running a hand through his hair. "I need to take this." He stepped toward the hallway, answering the call quietly. I didn't mean to listen, but when you share thin apartment walls for months, you get good at picking up tone. His voice was low, controlled. "No," I said I'd handle it. "That's not what we agreed on." My stomach tightened. Agreed on what? The call didn't last long, maybe 2 minutes. When he came back into the living room, his expression was neutral again. Too neutral. "You good?" he asked. I blinked at the shift. "You disappeared." "It was work." You don't usually take work calls at 9 at night. His eyes flickered. It's complicated. That word again. Complicated. Like the first time I'd heard it. Except now it didn't feel intriguing. Felt like distance. I sat up straighter. You don't have to tell me everything, I said carefully. But don't shut me out mid-conversation. I'm not shutting you out. You kind of are. Silence. He looked at me like he was weighing something. Then he exhaled slowly. It's my uncle, he said finally. That caught me off guard. Okay. He runs a small construction company. I help out sometimes. Paperwork. Fixing things. Stuff he doesn't want to deal with. That sounds normal. It is. But, his jaw tightened. He's not subtle about his opinions. Understanding clicked into place slowly. About you? I asked quietly. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He doesn't know, Nelson said after a moment. Not officially. But he suspects. A faint nod. And he doesn't like it. There it was. The thing he'd been careful about. The reason he didn't advertise. The reason he hesitated outside the apartment building. I'm not ashamed, he said quickly, like he needed me to know that. I didn't think you were. He stopped, frustrated. It's easier not to make it a thing. I stood, walking toward him slowly. It already is a thing, I said gently. He met my eyes. Because of me? Because of us. The word hung there. He swallowed. You think I'm pulling away. I think you get scared when it stops being hypothetical. That landed. He didn't argue. Instead, he stepped closer. Not defensive. Not distant. Just honest. I don't want to mess this up, he admitted. You're not. But if it gets messy, it might, I interrupted softly. That's not a reason to pretend it's not happening. He searched my face, looking for hesitation, for regret. I didn't give him any. I caught you in the hallway thinking you were doing something wrong, I said. Turns out you were helping someone. His expression softened. Maybe, I continued. This just looks scary because it matters. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. He reached for my hand, not hesitating this time. I don't want to hide you, he said quietly. I'm not asking you to fight anyone. I know. We stood there in the middle of my living room, hands linked, something unspoken settling between us. Not perfect, not dramatic, just real. Next time, I said gently, don't disappear on me. He nodded. Next time, don't assume I'm pulling away. Deal. He was scared of losing something he finally wanted to keep. Things didn't blow up. They didn't spiral. They just shifted. After that night, something between us settled into a steadier rhythm. Not perfect, not dramatic, just honest. Nelson didn't pretend his uncle didn't exist. I didn't pretend I wasn't aware of the tension hovering around that part of his life. But it stopped feeling like a threat and started feeling like something we were navigating together. A few days later, I caught him doing something else I wasn't expecting. It was Saturday morning. I stepped into the hallway with a trash bag in one hand and nearly collided with Nelson standing outside Mrs. Klein's door again. Only this time, he wasn't holding a package. He was holding flowers. I blinked. You branching out into burglary and romance now? I asked. He looked over his shoulder, smiling slightly. She's coming home today. Oh, her daughter called. Thought the place could use something fresh. The flowers weren't fancy. Just simple yellow daisies wrapped in brown paper. But something about the image hit me harder than it should have. You do this often? I asked. Help people. Yeah. He shrugged lightly. If I can. I leaned against the wall, watching him unlock the door. Hey, Nelson. He glanced back. Yeah. You know that night I saw you out here? Hard to forget. I really thought you were doing something wrong. He raised an eyebrow. We've established that. I smiled faintly. I think I just didn't understand you yet. He stepped inside briefly, placing the flowers in a glass of water on the kitchen counter. When he came back out, he locked the door again carefully. And now? He asked. Now I think you just don't like being watched. He studied me for a second. That's not entirely wrong. Why? He leaned back against the wall across from me, mirroring my posture. When you grow up in a house where people are always waiting for you to mess up, he said quietly, you learn to keep things close. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. Your uncle? I asked. Among others. I didn't press further. Instead, I stepped closer, lowering my voice. I'm not watching you to catch you slipping. I know. Then why do you still look like you're bracing sometimes? He hesitated, because he knew I was right. I guess, he said slowly. I'm not used to someone sticking around once they see everything. That hit deeper than he probably intended. Everything, I repeated. The quiet parts, the complicated parts, the not so easy to explain parts. I held his gaze. You think I'm here for the simple version of you? He didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. I reached for his hand, not in some dramatic gesture, just steady. Nelson, I said softly, I caught you doing something I thought was wrong. He gave me a small smile. Yeah. And every time since then, you've just been decent. His smile faded into something more serious. You make that sound rare. It kind of is. The hallway light flickered again overhead, casting brief shadows across his face. You're not wrong to be careful, I continued. But don't confuse careful with hiding. He exhaled slowly. I don't want to hide. Then don't. Footsteps echoed from the stairwell at the end of the hall. Mrs. Klein's daughter appeared first, followed by Mrs. Klein herself, moving slowly but steadily with a cane. Nelson immediately stepped forward. Welcome back, he said gently. Mrs. Klein beamed at him. You kept my plants alive? Mostly, she laughed, patting his arm. I watched the interaction quietly, the way he adjusted his pace to match hers. The way he didn't make a big show of helping, just did it. And something settled fully in my chest right then. I hadn't caught my neighbor doing the wrong thing. I caught him in a moment of vulnerability. In the split second before he knew how I'd interpret him. And instead of shutting me out after that night, he let me in. Later that evening, we sat on my balcony, city lights blinking below us. You know, I said, resting my elbows on the railing, if I hadn't forgotten my headphones that night. Yeah? He asked. I don't know how long we would have kept pretending. He stepped up beside me. We were terrible at pretending. True. He nudged my shoulder lightly. You always this observant? Only when it matters. A comfortable silence settled between us. Then he said quietly, I'm glad you asked instead of assuming. I looked at him. I almost didn't. Why did you? I thought about that. About the split second in the hallway. The way his face had looked, not guilty but caught off guard. I think, I said slowly, I wanted to understand before I judged. He held my gaze. That's not something everyone does. I smiled faintly. Well, guess you picked the right neighbor. He laughed softly. And then, more seriously, I'm not perfect. I didn't sign up for perfect. I've got baggage. Everyone does. He studied me like he was still trying to find the catch. I'm serious, Omar. So am I. The city hummed below us. Cars passing. Distant sirens. Normal life moving forward. You caught me doing the wrong thing, he said. I shook my head gently. No, I corrected. I caught you being human. His expression shifted at that. Not guarded. Not careful. Just us. Standing on a small balcony in a slightly questionable apartment complex. Knowing that sometimes the thing that looks wrong at first glance is just a story you haven't heard yet. And I'm really glad I stayed long enough to hear his.